30 days to sell the spring or bury a herd dead of thirst on cracked ground, that ultimatum would cost Holloway Crane everything, because nobody standing in that dust-choked yard knew the ragged drifter watering his horse at her well was a hunted gunslinger with a bounty on his head worth more than the ranch itself. I was passing through Doña Ana County that summer, partner, the summer of 1884, and what I saw at that well changed how I understood the word mercy. Her name was Maggie Doyle, 26 years old, widowed 11 months, running 400 head of cattle on land her husband Tom had bled for and finally died for, thrown from a green horse in a spring storm the year before. The spring on her property was called Cold Shoulder, a limestone seep that had never run dry in 3 generations of Doyles, and it was the only water for 11 miles of cracked alkali flat in either direction. A cattle baron named Holloway Crane wanted it, and Maggie's flat refusal was answer enough for him. He built a dam. Stay with me to the end of this one, because the man drinking from her trough that morning, the one with the flat, quiet eyes and the 2 tied-down colts, was about to become the last thing Holloway Crane ever should have provoked. And where you're listening from tonight, whatever the hour is on your side of the world, I want you to picture the New Mexico Territory in a summer, so dry the rivers cracked like old leather. This is her story. And his. Let me set the scene right the way I saw it, because a story like this doesn't start with the gunslinger. It starts with the widow, alone, doing arithmetic that wouldn't come out right no matter how many times she ran it. Maggie Doyle had inherited 1,100 acres, 400 head of cattle, a 2-room adobe house with a leaking roof, and a debt to the Territorial Land Office that her husband had never mentioned because men like Tom Doyle. She'd found out about the debt 3 weeks after the funeral, going through a cigar box of papers by lamplight, and she'd cried once hard, and then never again, not where anyone could see. She hired no help because she couldn't pay for any. She branded her own calves, rode fence alone in a canvas duster too big for her, and slept with her late husband's shotgun, leaned against the headboard, because a woman alone on open range learns fast that isolation. She was beautiful in the way hard work makes a person beautiful, sun-browned and lean-armed, dark hair always escaping its braid, and she'd stopped noticing the men in town who noticed her, because noticing back never once bought her a bag of grain. What she had, more than beauty, was stubbornness. It was the kind of stubbornness that makes some men fall in love with a woman, and makes other men want to break her. And Holloway Crane belonged firmly to the second category. Crane ran cattle on 40,000 acres north of the Doyle Spread, the biggest operation in 3 counties, and he had gotten there the way most big men get there in that country, buying out the weak, starving out the stubborn. He was 51 years old, thick through the shoulders, going soft at the belly, with a gray mustache he oiled every morning, and small, pale eyes that measured a man's worth in cattle and land before they'd finished shaking his hand. Crane's vice was pride, the specific, corrosive kind that can't tolerate a woman telling him no in front of his own men. He'd offered to buy the Doyle Spread twice in the past year, generous on paper and insulting underneath it, because both times he'd offered a third of what the land was worth, betting a grieving widow wouldn't know better or wouldn't have the nerve to argue. Both times her answer was the same flat refusal. The ranch wasn't for sale. The second time she'd given him a 5-count to clear her land, and he was already backing his horse toward the gate by 3. Crane didn't forget insults. He filed them the way another man files deeds, and he waited for the ground to shift in his favor. That summer, the drought did the shifting for him. No rain since March, creeks turned to cracked mud ribbons, and every rancher in the county watching the sky and praying to a God who wasn't answering. Crane had 7,000 head and water rights on paper that covered most of his own range. But paper water and real water are different animals in a dry year, and his northern tanks had gone to dust by June. Cold Shoulder Spring, sitting square in the middle of Maggie Doyle's 1,100 acres, was the last dependable water for miles, fed by some deep vein of limestone that the drought hadn't touched. Crane needed it. More than that, Crane wanted the satisfaction of finally taking something Maggie Doyle had refused to give him. So he sent his foreman and 2 riders up into the rocks above her property with picks and dynamite and orders to dam the spring's outflow, diverting what water still ran into a stock tank on Crane land, and to foul what little pooled on her side with dead cattle and lie so nothing living would touch it. It took them 4 days. Maggie found out on the 5th morning, when her cattle started bawling at a well, gone to a trickle of brown sludge, and she rode up into the rocks herself and stood there staring at raw dynamited stone where clear water used to run, and understood in her chest before her mind had caught up that Holloway Crane meant to kill her herd slow. 9 and full view of the whole county, and call it an act of nature. The message came 2 days after that, carried by Crane's land agent, a narrow, soft-spoken man named Ezra Vane, who wore a black coat too warm for the season and smiled with only the bottom half of his face. Vane's vice was a particular cowardly cunning, the kind that never got its own hands dirty and always had a paper ready to make the dirty thing look legal. He rode up to Maggie's porch with a folded document and a fountain pen, and he informed her, pleasant as a man discussing the weather, that Mr. Crane understood the spring situation was regrettable, that droughts were simply an act of providence, and that Mr. Crane was prepared, out of neighborly generosity, to purchase the Doyle spread for $800, provided the sale closed within 30 days. Maggie wanted to know plainly what became of the cattle if she refused. Vane's smile didn't move. The herd, he allowed, would likely perish of thirst before the month was out, given conditions, and land without cattle or water, sold for considerably less than $800, so she might want to consider the offer a kindness while it stood. Then he set the paper on her porch rail, weighted it with a stone so the wind wouldn't take it, and rode off without waiting for an answer, because he already knew what the drought would do to get him one. Maggie burned that paper in her cook stove that night, promising herself she'd find another way, but doing the honest math left her very little room to maneuver. 400 head, 11 miles from the nearest water she didn't own or couldn't afford to haul, and a bank in Las Cruces that had already declined to lend against land, under dispute. She thought about driving the herd to graze on the Whitcomb place 2 ranches over, but Old Man Whitcomb had his own drought to worry about and no charity left to spare. She thought about hauling water in barrels from town, and worked out that it would take 40 trips a day with the 1 wagon she owned to keep 400 head alive, an arithmetic that broke down inside an hour of trying. She was down to praying, which she did, kneeling by the bed at night, not for rain exactly, but for something, anything, to walk onto her land and change the numbers. She didn't expect her prayer to arrive on foot, leading a spent buckskin gelding, wearing trail dust thick enough to write your name in 3 days later at first light. Silas came down out of the Oregon mountains on a morning so hot the air over the flats shimmered like water that wasn't there. And he came the way men come when they're being careful about being followed, off the main road, keeping to draws and low ground, checking his back trail more than a man with nothing to hide ever needs to. He was 32, though the years on the run had put some extra weight of care into his face. Dark-haired, under a hat gone the color of the land itself, with a build honed, lean by hard travel, and eyes that took in a room a yard of tree line before they settled on anything as small as a person's face. 2 Colts rode low on his hips, tied down, the leather worn soft from use in a way that told its own quiet story. He'd smelled water before he saw it, that mineral green smell a spring gives off even half-choked, and he'd followed it to the fence line of the Doyle place where Maggie found him an hour later, leaning against her corral rail with his hat off, splashing water from her one good trough onto his face and neck, careful, she noticed, to leave most of it for the horse. She came around the barn with the shotgun already up, because a strange man drinking from her well with the whole valley gone thirsty and mean was not a coincidence she trusted, and her voice, when it came, was flat and plain. State his business or get moving. He straightened, slow, hands well away from his hips. His name, he offered, was Silas. He meant no trouble, and he'd pay for the water and work if she had any to spare, or ride on if she didn't want him there. Something in the stillness of him, the deliberate slowness of a man who understood exactly what a leveled shotgun could do and respected it, made her lower the barrel an inch. She looked him over, the state of his boots, the thinness under his shirt, the way his eyes kept drifting to the tree line behind her, like he expected trouble to come out of it any minute, and she made a decision that surprised her more than it surprised him. There was a rain barrel around back with clean water in it, she allowed. The trough was fouled and not fit for drinking, and if he wanted, there was a day's work mending fence for a meal and a place in the barn loft. It wasn't charity exactly. It was the last clean water on the ranch, and she was giving a stranger a share of it while her own cattle went dry, because something about the hollowed-out look of him spoke louder than her pride's urge to turn him away. He worked that fence line like a man who'd rather be tired than idle, and by evening he'd mended 200 yards of wire, and asked almost nothing about her business, which she appreciated more than she let on. Over a thin supper of beans and hard bread on her porch, the whole account came pouring out of her anyway, because there was no one else to tell it to, and the silence of the ranch had been sitting on her chest like a stone for 3 days. Cold Shoulder Spring and the dynamite, the 30 days. Holloway Crane's paper weighted down with a stone on her porch rail. Silas listened without much expression, but she saw his jaw tighten when she described the fouled trough, saw something go cold and still behind his eyes when she said the word dynamite. Only one question came back at her. How many riders did Crane keep on his payroll? When she put the number near 30, he nodded slowly like a man doing arithmetic of his own, a very different kind than hers. 30 riders and 1 dam didn't sound like an act of nature to him. She wanted to know what he meant by that, and the answer she got was short. Some problems in this country didn't get solved by praying for rain. Then he thanked her for the meal and went to sleep in the barn loft, and she lay awake a long while wondering what kind of man measured a rancher's riders like he was counting cards. Crane's men rode by the next afternoon, 3 of them, not by accident. The foreman leading them was a barrel-built man named Dutch Merrick, whose vice was a taste for cruelty. He dressed up as discipline, the kind of man who enjoyed watching something suffer, and called it teaching a lesson. Riding with him were 2 hired guns named Coy Ambrose, whose vice was drink, mean and unpredictable after the second bottle, and a rail-thin gun hand called Whit Larson, whose vice was a jealous vanity about his own reputation as the fastest hand in 3 counties. The 3 of them rode up slow to Maggie's fence line where Silas was working, and Dutch Merrick leaned on his saddle horn loud enough to carry, wondering aloud whether the Widow Doyle was taking in strays now. On account of the mangy one mending her wire looked like he hadn't eaten a square meal since Christmas. Silas didn't stop working. He set another wire staple with 3 even hammer strokes, not looking up, just passing through, helping where help was needed, and Mr. Merrick was welcome to ride on and let a man finish his work in peace. Something in the flatness of that answer, the complete absence of fear in a man who by all appearances had nothing, needled Dutch Merrick in a way he didn't enjoy. A man passing through, he growled, ought to know whose water he was drinking on. Cold Shoulder Spring belonged to Mr. Baugh. Crane, in every way that mattered, even if the deed claimed otherwise for now. And strangers, sniffing around a property under dispute, had a way of turning up missing in this country. It was meant as a threat, plain as daylight, and Maggie, coming out onto the porch at the sound of raised voices, felt her stomach drop at the casual menace of it. Silas straightened, then finally, and looked at the 3 riders with an attention that made even Whit Larson shift in his saddle. His voice stayed quiet. He'd heard threats before from men with better odds than 3 against 1, and he'd still be standing there in the morning. Mr. Merrick was welcome to test that if the itch got too bad to ignore. Coy Ambrose, 3 fingers into a flask he kept in his vest, laughed too loud and reached for the pistol on his hip, more bravado than intent, and Silas moved. Nobody in that yard saw exactly how it happened. One moment, Silas stood with his hands loose at his sides, and the next, there was a gun in his fist and a spray of dirt kicking up 2 inches from the toe of Coy Ambrose's boot, the report cracking flat across the dry air before the echo had time to catch up. Ambrose froze with his own pistol, half-drawn hand suddenly unsteady, and Dutch Merrick's horse sidestepped hard at the noise. Silas held the smoking Colt loose and easy, not aimed at anyone now, just held, a demonstration rather than an attack. The next one wouldn't be a warning, he promised, and 3 men who wanted to ride home to supper ought to consider that math before they made him prove it twice. Dutch Merrick's face went the color of old brick. This wasn't finished, he spat. Mister. Crane would hear about a stranger drawing on his men, and he wheeled his horse and rode off with Ambrose and Larson close behind, throwing one long look back at Silas like a man memorizing a face for later. Maggie stood on the porch, with her heart going hard against her ribs, and when the dust settled, her question came out not quite steady. Who exactly was he? He looked at her for a long moment, that same careful stillness in his eyes. His name was Silas, true as far as it went, and some things about a man were better left for another night. She didn't push. But she noticed, walking back inside, that her hands were shaking less from fear now than from something else entirely, something she didn't have a name for yet. Before we go further, I want to ask you something, because a story like this only means anything if you're really in it with me. Where are you listening from tonight, and what time is it where you are? Maybe you're driving home from a long shift. Maybe you're lying in the dark with the lights off. Maybe it's the middle of the afternoon somewhere, and you've got this on while you work. Wherever you are, tell me down in the comments, because I read every one of them, and because a story about a woman refusing to be starved off her own land deserves to travel as far as this app will carry it. If you're new here, welcome to the fire. Settle in. We've got a long night of story ahead of us, and I promise you it gets worse before it gets better, and then it gets a great deal better than you're expecting. Now, back to Doña Ana County, back to that porch, back to a widow who had just watched a stranger draw 2 guns faster than her eye could follow, and was starting to understand that the man mending her fence line. It came out slow over the following days, the way real truths do when a person's been guarding them a long time. Silas stayed on because Maggie asked him to, telling herself it was only sensible with Crane's men circling closer, and because some quiet, unadmitted part of her didn't want him gone yet. He worked her fences and dug at the fouled trough, trying to salvage some of the seep water, and in the evenings when the heat broke and the crickets started up, they sat on the porch and talked, careful and slow, 2 people feeling out the edges of trust. It was Maggie who found the paper first, not snooping, just gathering his shirt to mend a torn seam, and a folded square fell out of the breast pocket, worn soft from handling, a printed Dodger with a crude woodcut likeness that was rough but recognizable. $1,500, dead or alive, for a man wanted in 3 territories on charges that the paper listed only as murder and flight. No further detail, the kind of flat official language that could mean anything from a cold-blooded killer. She confronted him with it that night, the paper flat on the porch rail between them, her voice low but not frightened, exactly, more like a woman bracing for a wound she already half expected. She asked him if it was true. He didn't reach for the paper, didn't deny it, didn't do any of the things a guilty man does to buy time. He said it was true that there was a bounty, true that men had died by his hand, and that the rest of the story was more complicated than a wanted poster had room to print. She told him she was listening and meant it, and so he told her, there in the dark, with the crickets going and her late husband's shotgun leaning inside the door not 4 feet away. He told her his name had once been something else, a name he didn't use anymore, and that 6 years back he'd ridden for a cattle outfit in the Texas Panhandle, owned by a man named Colonel Ranhasketh, a man who ran his range the way Holloway Crane was learning to run his. Silas had been young then, good with a gun, hired for exactly the kind of work he now refused to do, and it had taken him 2 years to understand what kind of outfit he was riding for. The breaking point, he said, had been a homestead family, a widow and her 2 boys, not unlike Maggie's own situation, squeezed off good bottom land by the Colonel's riders. Silas had been ordered to burn their barn as a persuasion, and when he'd refused, the Colonel had sent 2 other men to do it instead, and the fire had gotten away from them in a dry wind and taken the house too, with the widow inside, trying to save what she could. Silas had ridden in during the burning, too late to save her, in time only to kill the 2 men who'd started the fire, both of them Hasketh riders, both of them, in the eyes of Texas law, murdered by a hired gun settling some private grudge, because the Colonel had friends in the courthouse and money enough to make sure the official story left out the burning barn and the dead widow entirely. Silas had run because staying meant hanging for the one decent thing he'd done in 2 years of indecent work, and he'd been running since. Territory to territory, never staying anywhere long enough to be found, never getting close enough to anyone to put them at risk when the bounty men eventually caught his trail, because they always eventually did. Maggie sat with that a long while before she spoke. She asked him why he'd stopped at her well that morning instead of riding wide around a ranch with trouble written all over it the way a careful hunted man should have. He said he'd smelled water and hadn't eaten in 2 days and honestly hadn't the strength left to be careful, and that when he'd seen a woman running a ranch alone with fear behind her eyes that she was working very hard to hide, something in him that he'd thought Texas burned out of him 6 years back had refused to just keep walking. She told him then that she believed him about the widow, about the fire, about the 2 men he'd killed for a reason that wasn't murder, no matter what the paper said. And she watched something loosen in his shoulders that had probably been locked tight since that burning barn. He told her quiet that she should be careful trusting a wanted man. The trouble followed him the way it was clearly already following her, and that the smart thing, the safe thing, was to let him move on before Crane's men. Maggie looked at him a long moment in the dark and said that 30 days from now, she'd either have her spring back or she wouldn't have a ranch at all, and that she'd rather face this with a man who'd killed to save a widow than face it alone. He didn't argue further. Something had been decided between them that neither one said aloud. What followed was training, plain and unglamorous, the kind of work that never makes it into the songs men sing about gunfighters. Maggie owned her husband's old shotgun and a battered Winchester she barely knew how to load, and Silas set about teaching her both, patient in a way that surprised her, given the speed she'd seen him draw against Crane's men. He didn't teach her to be fast. He told her flat out that fast got people killed who hadn't earned it yet, and that what she needed instead was steady and calm, and the kind of aim that came from repetition rather than instinct. They spent mornings at a fence post, 200 yards out, him correcting her stance, her breathing, the set of her shoulders, until the tin cans lined along the rail fell in a rhythm that stopped surprising her. He taught her to read a man's stance for the tell that came half a second before a draw, the shift of weight, the flex of the hand, small things that meant the difference between reacting and being too late. She was a quick study, sharper than he'd expected, and there were mornings he caught himself watching her work the lever action with a kind of pride that had nothing to do with the coming fight and everything to do with simply watching her become someone. They worked on the spring, too, in whatever hours the shooting practice left them, hauling brush and loose stone up into the rocks to see what could be salvaged of the flow without the dynamite work required to properly reopen it. It was slow, frustrating labor, and twice Silas rode the ridgeline above the dam site at night, alone, studying the way Crane's men had piled the blast rubble, working out in his head how a man might undo 4 days of dynamite work with hand tools and patience rather than more explosives that would only draw Crane's riders down on them faster. He was careful never to be seen up there moving the way a hunted man moves, low and quiet and always watching his back trail, and it was on the second of those nights that he confirmed what he'd already suspected. that Crane kept 2 riders posted near the dam after dark, meaning Crane knew, or at least feared, that someone might try exactly what Silas was planning. Word of the standoff at Maggie's fence line had reached Holloway Crane within the hour, carried by a furious Dutch Merrick, and Crane's reaction was not the reasonable retreat a smarter man might have chosen. His pride, wounded twice now by the same stubborn widow and freshly insulted by some drifter drawing on his foreman, hardened into something meaner. He sent Ezra Vane back out to Maggie's porch 3 days later with a revised offer, $600 now instead of $8, the number dropping to punish her for the delay, and a verbal message on top of the paper that Vane delivered with his usual soft, unbothered smile. Mr. Crane wished her to understand that the offer would keep shrinking the longer she waited, that her cattle were already showing signs of the thirst, thin and listless in the heat, and that a man who'd drawn a gun on Crane riders once would not be permitted to do so twice without consequences. Maggie told Vane, in words plainer than she usually allowed herself, exactly what he could tell Mr. Hackare. Crane to do with his $600, and Vane rode off, still smiling that same maddening half-smile, already composing, she was certain, the next escalation in his narrow, careful head. The escalation came 4 nights later, and it came the way Crane's kind of cruelty always came, indirect, deniable, dressed up as accident. Maggie woke past midnight to the smell of smoke and the frantic bawling of cattle, and ran out to find her hay barn ablaze, flames already climbing into the dry timber roof, the fire moving with the particular hungry speed that told her, even in her panic, that it hadn't started by itself. Silas was out of the loft and running before she'd cleared her own porch steps, and between the two of them and every bucket the ranch owned, they kept the fire from spreading to the house and the stock pens, though the hay barn burned to its foundation by dawn. Hay, she'd needed to see the herd through what was left of the drought. In the gray light after, working the last smoldering embers, Silas found a boot print near the barn's back wall that didn't belong to either of them, a distinctive worn heel he recognized from 3 nights of watching Crane's dam guards from the ridgeline. He didn't tell Maggie who he suspected, not yet, because suspicion wasn't proof, but she saw the look on his face and understood without being told that this fire had been set by human hands, and that the 30 days Crane had promised were shrinking faster than the calendar alone accounted for. That fire changed something in Maggie that no amount of shooting practice had quite finished changing. She stood in the ashes of her barn at sunrise, soot-streaked and furious in a way grief had never quite let her be, and she told Silas flat and certain that she was done being patient, done hoping Crane would tire of tormenting her, done waiting for the territorial law in Las Cruces to notice a widow's ruin was anything more than bad luck and bad weather. She wanted her spring back properly, and she wanted Holloway Crane to answer for the dam and the fouled water, and now the fire, in front of witnesses who couldn't be paid or frightened into looking the other way. Silas told her that was exactly the kind of thinking that got people killed if it wasn't planned carefully, and then, seeing the set of her jaw, allowed that it was also exactly the kind of thinking that occasionally worked, provided the planning was good enough to survive contact with Dutch Merrick's temper and Crane's pride both at once. They spent that day, exhausted as they were, not resting but planning, spreading a hand-drawn map of the property across the kitchen table and working out point by point how a rancher and a hunted gunslinger might turn 30 days of siege back on the man who'd started it. The plan had 3 parts, and the first was patience of a different kind than waiting, the patience of preparation. Silas rode into the town of Tierra Blanca under cover of buying supplies, careful to keep his hat low and his face turned from anyone who might recognize a wanted man's likeness from a dodger nailed to some sheriff's wall. He found the county land recorder, a tired, honest, older man named Otis Fell, who'd watched Crane push out 3 other small ranchers over the years and clearly hated every minute of documenting it. And Silas asked him careful and roundabout whether water rights disputes in the territory required proof of active fouling or sabotage to bring before a judge, or whether a rancher's word alone carried weight. Fell told him, lowering his voice, that a judge would need to see the dam itself and preferably a witness who wasn't the aggrieved party, and that if such evidence existed, Judge Amos Pruitt held circuit court in Tierra Blanca on the second Tuesday of every month, which happened to fall 11 days from that afternoon. Silas thanked him and laughed without giving his name, and rode back to the ranch with the beginning of a second plan taking shape behind his careful eyes, one that didn't rely only on guns. The second part of the plan was the dam itself, and this was where Silas's professional care showed plainest. He refused to rush it. Twice more he scouted the dam site at night, mapping the guard rotation Crane kept posted there, noting that the two riders swapped shifts at midnight and dawn and grew careless in the hour before each change, tired men waiting to be relieved. He and Maggie worked out a night when the moon would be thin, and they spent 2 full days beforehand rigging what Silas called persuasion rather than violence, snares of rope and deadfall logged along the approach trail that wouldn't kill a man, a scattering of loose shale at the guard posts that would betray careless footing, a picket line of Maggie's own gentlest horses, staked where their spooking would raise an alarm without anyone needing to fire a shot. Silas was firm on that point, firmer than Maggie expected. He told her plain that the goal wasn't to kill Crane's hired men, boys, mostly, paid to do a job and not owners of the cruelty behind it, but to break the dam, gather proof, and get Judge Pruitt's circuit court to do the rest of the work that guns alone couldn't finish cleanly. The third part was the hardest for Maggie to hear because it meant Silas riding into Tierra Blanca in daylight, wanted poster and all, to fetch Judge Pruitt's deputy and a witness willing to ride back out and see the dam with their own eyes before Crane's men could rebuild or hide it. It was a risk that could end with Silas recognized, arrested, or shot on sight by some bounty hunter who happened to be passing through, and she told him so plainly, standing too close to him in the lamplight of her kitchen, with her hands twisted in her apron. He told her he knew the risk better than she did, having carried it 6 years, and that some things, watching a decent woman lose her land the same way that Texas widow had lost her life, were worth the risk finally landing on him instead of some other innocent person down the line. There was a long, quiet moment between them, then charged with something neither one gave a name to, and Maggie only nodded, because she understood, watching his face, that arguing wouldn't move him, and because some stubborn, honest part of her respected a man who'd finally found something he judged worth more than his own safety. The night they moved on, the dam came 11 days after the barn fire, moonlight thin as Silas had wanted, the whole valley holding its breath under a sky gone hard and starry with the drought. Maggie rode with him part way against his initial objection until he saw the set of her jaw and understood arguing with her was no more productive than her arguing with him had been, and they left her horse picketed a half-mile out while they climbed the last stretch on foot. The 2 guards posted at the dam that night were young riders, more bored than dangerous, and the snares did exactly what Silas had built them to do. The first guard's foot found the shale scatter and went down hard with a shout that carried across the rocks, and by the time the second guard came stumbling toward the noise with his rifle half raised, Silas was already between him and the dam, Colt drawn but not fired, voice low and level, telling both young men that nobody needed to bleed tonight if they had the sense to sit down where they were and stay there. They did. Bored, underpaid, and facing a man whose stillness radiated more danger than any amount of shouting could have. Both riders sat exactly where they were told, and Maggie, climbing up behind Silas with her own rifle steady in her hands, felt something settle in her chest that was almost peace. Breaking the dam took the rest of the night, hard physical work with pick and bar, prying loose the rubble cranes men had packed against the spring's natural channel, and somewhere in the small hours the water broke through with a sound Maggie would remember the rest of her life. A low grinding rush, and then a clean, bright rustle as Cold Shoulder Spring found its old path again, running down toward her fouled trough and beyond it toward the flats where her cattle stood waiting. She stood in the dark, with water soaking her boots, and cried for the first time since the night she'd found Tom's debt papers in a cigar box, and this time she didn't try to stop herself. Silas stood beside her, letting her have the moment, and when she finally looked over at him, he was watching the water too, something unguarded on his face that she hadn't seen before, not the flat, careful stillness of a hunted man. A long time before Texas and a burning barn had changed the shape of him. They rode back before dawn with the 2 captured guards, who Silas released a mile from the ranch with a warning rather than a rope, on the theory. He told Maggie that frightened boys who'd seen mercy talked more useful truth in a courtroom than angry ones nursing a grudge. Ward reached Holloway Crane by mid-morning that his dam had been broken, and 2 of his men had spent the night sitting on rocks at gunpoint, and the fury that news produced in him was not the calculated fury of a careful man. He rode for the Doyle place himself that afternoon with Dutch Merrick, Coy Ambrose, and Whit Larson at his back, and 8 more riders besides a small army compared to 2 people in a fence line, and he came not to negotiate but to finish the thing outright. Land office paperwork be damned. Because Crane had stopped thinking about paper the moment he'd heard about the dam. What he didn't know, riding down into that yard with 11 armed men behind him, was that Silas had already ridden for Tierra Blanca that morning, before Crane's fury had even reached him, carrying word to Judge Pruitt's deputy and to Otis Fell, the land recorder, drawn by an account of a fouled spring and a burned barn that even a cautious county official couldn't quite ignore. Crane's riders fanned out around the house at dusk, and Maggie stood on her porch alone, Silas having ridden for town hours before, with the plan that he'd be back well within the day, though the day was fast running out and no dust plume. Crane himself dismounted slow and deliberate, cane in hand, though he didn't need it, a prop of authority more than support, and he told Maggie, loud enough for his men and for her to both hear plainly, that her drifter's little stunt at the dam had cost her whatever patience he had left. By the deed if she'd sign it, or by simple occupation if she wouldn't, and that a woman alone with no gunman standing behind her anymore had exactly no leverage left to argue the point. Maggie's hand rested near the rifle propped just inside her door, close enough to reach. She told him, voice steadier than she felt, that the spring was already running again, and that half the county would know why by morning, and that a man who'd send hired boys to poison water and burn hay didn't get to call himself neighborly, no matter how much land he'd stacked up. Crane's face darkened, and he took one step toward the porch, cane raised half in gesture and half in threat, and it was in that moment, with the light going long and red across the yard, that the dust plume Maggie had been watching for. It was not at first look the rescue Crane expected, and it took him a long, confused moment to understand what he was seeing. Silas rode in the lead, yes, but beside him rode Judge Amos Pruitt's deputy, a broad, unhurried man named Sheriff's Deputy Wardell Cobb, wearing a territorial badge that carried weight even out here in disputed country. Drawed breathe the 2 young dam guards Silas had released with a warning the night before, who had, it turned out, ridden straight to Deputy Cobb themselves that morning to swear out a statement about a dam, a fouling, and a foreman named Dutch Merrick. Crane's fury curdled fast into something closer to panic as the riders reined up in the yard, because a proud man's plans rarely survive contact with an actual lawman standing in the middle of them. He informed Crane, in the flat procedural language of a man who delivered bad news to worse men, that he'd ridden out on sworn testimony of sabotage to a water source, arson against the Doyle property, and armed trespass currently in progress before his own eyes, and that Judge Pruitt would be very interested in hearing Mr. Forer's. Crane's account of all three at Circuit Court in 3 days' time, along with the account of his foreman, whom the two young riders had already named as the man who'd ordered the barn burned. Ezra Vane, who'd ridden in the back of Crane's party, hoping, as always, to remain unnoticed, made the mistake of trying to slip his horse quietly toward the tree line at the mention of court, and Otis Fell, of all people, called out that Vane's own signature was on the coercive land offer sitting in Fell's satchel that very moment, filed as evidence of extortion under color of a legitimate sale, a filing Fell had apparently been building the paperwork for since the second time Crane had lowballed the widow. Vane's careful, cowardly cunning had finally run out of paper to hide behind, and he stopped his horse mid-flight, shoulders sagging with the particular defeat of a small man caught small. Dutch Merrick, cornered and never a subtle thinker, even at the best of times, went for his gun rather than his dignity, a decision his vice for cruelty had never taught him to weigh against real consequence. He was fast, but not fast in the way that mattered against a man who'd survived 6 years of being hunted by faster men than Merrick would ever be. Silas's shot took the pistol clean out of Merrick's hand before the barrel had cleared leather, the bullet striking steel rather than flesh, and Merrick howled and clutched a stinging, bloodless hand. Coy Ambrose, 3 fingers deep into a flask even at that hour, made the same mistake Merrick had, drink loosening a courage that sober judgment would have kept in check, and Silas put a second shot through the crown of Ambrose's hat, close enough to feel, and Ambrose sat frozen in his saddle, with both hands raised so fast, his hat nearly followed the bullet off his head. Whit Larson, watching both of his companions humbled inside 4 seconds by a man he'd been itching all summer to test himself against, found that his vanity about being fastest hand in 3 counties had quietly evaporated. It was Holloway Crane himself, in the end, who forced the last and worst of it, because pride, pushed all the way to the wall, doesn't retreat, it lashes out. Seeing his foreman disarmed and his hired guns cowed and his land agent named as an extortionist in front of a territorial deputy, Crane's carefully built authority collapsed into raw fury, and he drew the pistol he kept hidden inside his coat, not aiming at Silas, who had just watched humble 2 of his best men in the space of a breath, but swinging instead toward Maggie on the porch, toward the widow whose stubborn refusal had cost him this humiliation in front of his own riders. It was the coward's target, the safe one. He judged wrong. Maggie had the rifle from just inside her door in her hands before Crane's pistol had fully cleared his coat. The months of patient practice at that fence post, 200 yards out, collapsing into a single instant of steady, calm aim, exactly the way Silas had taught her. No fear left in her hands at all. She fired once. The shot took Crane high in the shoulder, spinning him hard off his feet and dropping the pistol from fingers gone suddenly numb, and he hit the dry ground of his own ambition, with a cry more of shock than pain, because in all his 51 years of buying and burying and bullying his way across 3 counties, It had apparently never once occurred to Holloway Crane that the widow herself might be the one to finally stop him. The silence after that shot stretched long across the yard, broken only by Crane's ragged breathing and the distant bawl of cattle finally drinking their fill at a spring running clean again for the first time in 11 days. Deputy Cobb moved first, dismounting to see to Crane's wound, which was painful and bloody but far from fatal. A clean shoulder shot from a woman who'd been taught to aim for exactly that kind of ending. He informed Crane none too gently that he was now under arrest on charges of sabotage, arson, extortion, and assault with intent, that his foreman would be joining him in the county jail in Tierra Blanca, and that Judge Pruitt tended to take a dim view of cattle barons who thought territorial water law was optional when it inconvenienced them. Ezra Vane, seeing the direction of the wind conclusively, began talking fast and eager about how he'd merely followed instructions, an account Otis Fell noted down with visible satisfaction, since a talking Vane meant a stronger case and a longer memory of exactly whose orders had done the damage. Coy, Ambrose, and Whit Larson, disarmed and thoroughly chastened, were let go with warnings and the clear understanding that Crane's operation, and their wages along with it, had just changed considerably for the worse. Maggie stood on her porch with the rifle still warm in her hands, watching Holloway Crane, loaded, cursing and bleeding, onto a wagon for the ride to town, and she felt none of the satisfaction she might have expected from a moment she'd half dreamed of since the day he'd first lowballed her land. What she felt instead was a kind of exhausted clarity, the specific relief of a burden finally, actually lifted rather than merely postponed. Silas came up onto the porch steps beside her as the wagon pulled away, holstering his own Colt, slow, and, he told her, quiet, that she'd done exactly right, steady, and calm just like they'd practiced, and that Crane would carry that shoulder wound the rest of his days as a permanent physical reminder of the morning he'd mistaken a widow for an easy target. Maggie looked at the rifle in her own hands like she was seeing it for the first time, and said that 11 months ago she wouldn't have believed she was capable of that shot. And Silas told her that 11 months ago she hadn't needed to be, and that the woman standing on this porch now had simply become who the year had required her to become. It wasn't a compliment exactly, it was truer than that. The days that followed carried their own quieter reckoning. Judge Pruitt's circuit court meeting that second Tuesday as scheduled heard testimony from Deputy Cobb, from Otis Fell's carefully filed papers, from the 2 young dam guards, and from a thoroughly cooperative Ezra Vane, and the resulting judgment stripped Crane of any claim to Cold Shoulder Spring, fined him heavily for the sabotage and the arson both, and left Dutch Merrick facing a longer sentence for the barn fire that had come within a hair of burning Maggie and Silas alive along with 4 months of hay. It came out, too, in the course of the hearing that the territorial land debt Maggie had inherited from Tom had been quietly bought up months earlier by a Crane-affiliated bank, hoping to squeeze her from 2 directions at once. A scheme the judgment unwound entirely, leaving Maggie's ranch for the first time since her husband's death, genuinely and fully her own. She sat through every session of that hearing in her one good dress, back straight, answering every question the judge put to her plainly and without flinching, and by the time the gavel came down on the final ruling, half of Tierra Blanca had heard the whole story. Silas did not sit in that courtroom. He couldn't, not with a $1,500 bounty still following him through 3 territories, and he'd known from the start that his part in this story had to end before any official record of it named him clearly enough for a bounty hunter to follow the trail home to Maggie's door. He stayed through the circuit court days at a line shack on the far edge of the property, out of sight, and it was there, the evening after the judgment came down, that Maggie rode out to find him, the spring running clear behind her all the way down to a herd finally, fully watered. She found him sitting outside the shack watching the sunset burn orange and gold over land that was, now, unquestionably hers, and she sat down beside him without being asked, the way she'd have done for no other living soul. They didn't talk long that evening because there wasn't a great deal left that needed saying out loud. Maggie told him the ranch was safe now, the debt unwound, Crane facing real consequence, and that none of it would have happened without him standing at her well that first thirsty morning instead of riding on past. Silas told her that he'd known the moment he tasted her rain barrel water and watched her lower that shotgun an inch that he was in more danger of staying than any bounty hunter had ever put him in, and that staying wasn't a danger he could let himself risk, not with a price on his head that would eventually inevitably follow him to wherever he settled and put anyone near him in the path of it. This was the bittersweet turn of it, partner. The part of these stories that never sits easy, no matter how many times I've told one like it, around a fire. He wasn't leaving because he didn't care for her. He was leaving because he did, and because a hunted man staying was its own kind of danger to the very people he cared about. A lesson Texas had already taught him once in Fire and Blood, and one he refused to let repeat itself here. Maggie didn't argue him out of it, though it cost her something to let it go unargued. She understood, better than most, what it meant to love a piece of ground enough to stay and fight for it, and she recognized in Silas the mirror of that same fierce, stubborn devotion, turned instead toward protecting the people he touched by keeping his distance from them. She told him only that Cold Shoulder Spring would run clear for as long as she had breath to defend it, that her door and her well would remain open to any tired stranger who needed either, and that if a certain quiet drifter ever found himself riding this direction again, with the bounty finally lifted or outrun, Silas told her that was a fine thing to ride toward, better than most men in his position had any right to hope for. And in the gray hour before dawn, with the spring water running loud enough to hear from the porch, and the whole ranch finally blessedly safe, he saddled the buckskin gelding and rode out west, away from Tierra Blanca and its courthouse records, away from Crane's broken operation, away from the woman he'd chosen not to endanger by staying. Maggie stood at her fence line and watched him go until the dust of him had folded into the horizon entirely, and she did not cry this time, because what she felt standing there wasn't loss exactly. It was gratitude, clean and whole, for a debt of water repaid 100 times over, and for a season of her life in which a stranger's kindness at a well had taught her finally what she herself was capable of when the ground under her feet was worth defending. The spring ran full that whole autumn, and into the winter, and Maggie Doyle's herd, 400 head strong, grew fatter and healthier than they'd been in the 2 dry years before the drought had ever started, drinking from water that had waited 3 generations for someone stubborn enough to defend it. Word of the widow who'd shot a cattle baron off his own horse traveled the county the way such stories do, growing a little in the telling each time, though the honest bones of it stayed the same in every version. A woman alone had refused to be starved off her land, and had found at the bottom of her worst summer the nerve to make good on that refusal herself, rifle in hand, when it finally mattered most. Some nights, sitting on that porch with the spring running clear below and the stars coming up hard and close the way they do in that country, Maggie thought she heard hoofbeats on the ridge road and told herself it was only the wind, and let herself hope anyway, because hope, unlike Holloway Crane's dam, was one thing nobody in this world could ever quite manage to shut off for good. So, that's the story, partner, the whole of it, the way I saw it and the way it was told to me by folks who saw the rest. A cattle baron tried to starve a widow off her own land by choking the one spring that kept her herd alive, and he never once counted on the ragged stranger, drinking from her trough, being a hunted gunslinger with a debt of his own to repay, nor did he count on the widow herself becoming, by the end of it, every bit as steady and dangerous as the man who taught her to shoot. That's the thing about this country I've never stopped marveling at, all these years of telling stories by the fire. It takes the hardest ground and somehow grows the hardest, most stubborn hearts to match it, and every so often, two of those hearts find each other at exactly the moment both of them need it most. If this story found you tonight, wherever you're listening from, whatever hour it is where you sit, do an old storyteller a kindness and leave it a like before you go. And if you're not yet part of this fire circle, hit subscribe, because there's always another story coming. Always another widow or drifter or hunted man finding out what they're made of when the ground gets hard enough to test them. This story and the folks in it are a work of fiction, told in the old campfire tradition, brought to you with the help of some modern tools, AI among them, in service of a very old kind of storytelling. Until the next one, partner, stay steady, keep your water clean, and take care of the ground that takes care of you.